Welcome to the Moved to Meditate podcast. I'm your host, Addie D. Hilster. This is a place for vibrant discussions about mindfulness, movement practices, and ways to find more balance and presence in daily life. Here you'll find resources to help you progress on your path, as well as insightful conversations with mindful movement, yoga, meditation, and Dharma teachers from a range of traditions. On this podcast, we spotlight embodied approaches to mindfulness and the more contemplative aspects of movement practice. Listen in and connect to a community of like-minded practitioners. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining me today. I was on retreat last week, both practicing and leading mindful movement sessions for the annual meditation retreat with my friends at Bodhi Path, which is a Tibetan Buddhist group. And it was wonderful to unplug and practice with them. And I'm happy to be back with a new episode today. I'm doing several solo episodes right now, partly due to my schedule and also just wanting to explore some ideas like the topic of today's episode. But in June, I'll be posting some more interviews with guests, and there are some really interesting topics in the works. I'll tell you more later. But in other podcast news, I discovered yesterday that this show has been downloaded on all 6 continents, not counting Antarctica, because I'm not sure how long it'll take to tap into the South Pole mindful movement community, right? And on some of the continents, of course, it's maybe like 1 or 2 downloads at this point, but it just blows my mind to think of how we can connect from near and from really, really far. How cool is that? Wherever you are listening from right now, thank you so much for being here. Okay, speaking of exploring ideas, on this podcast, what we talk about is mindful movement and meditation, right? Well, it turns out I've never actually done an episode on exactly what is mindful movement. I think it's been mentioned, briefly here and there, but I thought it would be worth really kind of diving into this and describing and defining what I mean by mindful movement. It's kind of a generic term, which leaves a lot of room for interpretation. So I'll talk about some basic ways we could think of what mindful movement is, and some ways I think we could lean more into the mindful part. So it really becomes something that you might call movement-based mindfulness. For lack of a better term, I rack my brain for terms for these things all the time. But part of the reason this is on my mind is because I'm in the midst of working on a new offering that's going live soon. And it's an 8-week online program called Ease into Meditation, a movement-based mindfulness course. This course is designed to cover many of the same principles you would learn in any introductory mindfulness meditation program, but with a key difference in the method. You would be learning the mindfulness skills here first through movement, getting familiar through movement with what mindfulness feels like, using it to calm your nervous system, and to gain confidence that you can then apply any of those techniques in sitting meditation. And I promise this episode is not just a giant commercial for the course, but I'm mentioning it because it's connected. And if you hear this and you're interested in exploring mindful movement in that way, do go to my website and check it out. It starts on May 30th of 2023, not too long after when I'm recording this. But you do the lessons on your own time whenever you want to during the week. And if you're listening to this many months later and you're still interested, I do plan to offer it again in the future, so it'd still be worth checking the website. I'll put the link to this in the show notes, and you can also find it by just looking around on my website at movedtomeditate.yoga under the Practice With Me menu. It's called Ease into Meditation course, so that's how you would find it. Okay, with all those announcements, should we dive into this question of what is mindful movement? Like I said a moment ago, mindful movement is a pretty general sounding term. Like both the words mindfulness and movement are used in a wide variety of ways. So it's not always that obvious what is meant by either one, or when we combine them together and say mindful movement. And perhaps the term mindful movement does get us part of the way there because the term sounds different than other kinds of movement, like moving for sport or for recreation or for fitness or health or as an aesthetic art form. There's many reasons people do movement, right? And the distinctions are not always that black and white. There are plenty of movement activities that might cross into multiple purposes. Like, for example, yoga or Qigong can both be done as contemplative practices or for health purposes, or for both. And you might argue that for some, yoga has even become an aesthetic art form, kind of like how dance is an aesthetic art form, where the priority is making beautiful, impressive, Instagrammable shapes and cool choreographies, more than doing yoga as a contemplative or health practice. But I digress. Then, some of us actually lean more into the mindful part of mindful movement, or in more specific ways. We try to draw the mindful aspect out. I've been playing with calling it movement-based mindfulness to indicate that intention. And this is really what I'm interested in as a practitioner and teacher, so I'll talk more about that in a moment. But first, a simple definition of mindful movement could just be like movement done with awareness. It could be any kind of movement. And of course, things like yoga, Tai Chi, Qigong would be under that umbrella, but also walking, hiking, running, Pilates, weightlifting, swimming. Whatever you would want to do to move your body, you can do that with full presence. If you Google mindful movement, this is essentially the description you'll find. And most of the things that come up when you do that kind of a search, they focus on body awareness, or they might mention checking in with your body as you do exercises or movements. This is all good, and I have no arguments with any of that. I think you can engage the mindfulness potentials within movement to different degrees, depending on your interests and needs. My sense is that pretty much anyone could benefit by paying more attention to what they're doing in movement or exercise, or just being more present and less checked out during those activities. It might be safer. It might be good injury prevention. And it's likely to enhance the mental health benefits of whatever movement activity you're doing. There's even some evidence that it could also enhance the physical health benefits. An example of that I'm aware of is one study that was published in 2016 in a journal called Complementary Therapies in Medicine that looked at the effects of regular walking exercise versus mindful walking exercise in a group of diabetes patients. For context, it was a small study. It was like 23 participants, and it's just one study. So we can't draw too many conclusions from it, and I would have to do more reading to see if there's been more research of this kind to validate the findings. But here's what they did in the study. I'm just going to read you their little paragraph description from the paper. It says, 23 patients with type 2 diabetes, aged 50 to 75 years, were randomly allocated into a traditional walking exercise group or a Buddhism-based walking meditation exercise group. Both groups performed a 12-week exercise program that consisted of walking on the treadmill at an exercise intensity of 50 to 70% maximum heart rate for 30 minutes a session 3 times a week. In the walking meditation training program, the participants performed walking on the treadmill while concentrating on footstepping by voicing bu and da with each footstep that contacted the floor to practice mindfulness while walking. So that's how they describe the design of the study. So this was not the formal walking meditation that we do when we walk really slowly and feel each part of the footstep. It was more like a mindful exercise walking, comparable to the exercise intensity that the other group was doing, but with the added focus on the mantra they gave them of Buddha. After 12 weeks, both groups had some measurable fitness improvements and improvements to their blood glucose levels, as is expected with exercise, but only the walking meditation group had a decrease in blood pressure and an increase in artery health. The walking meditation group also had a decrease in the stress hormone cortisol, which the regular exercise group didn't get. So this hints at the power of simply paying more attention while we're doing whatever movement or exercise activities we do. But I also think there is an interesting possibility to take the mindfulness training further within movement for those who are looking for an alternate route for exploring meditative experiences where you don't always have to be still, or for meditators interested in bringing their mindfulness practice into more daily life activities. What I'm calling movement-based mindfulness is also more than just yoga for meditators, which is usually just like a few suggested poses or stretches to alleviate tension from sitting. Over the years, I've seen many articles and a few books of that kind, and it always feels to me like, okay, sure, this is important, but isn't there more? Often the movement and the meditation are treated as so separate, where you're kind of just using the yoga or movement to get ready for the, quote, real meditation. And yes, movement does help prepare us for stillness, of course, because it works so directly on the physical body and the nervous system. But it can also be more than just a preparatory practice. So you can find plenty of resources out there on hip stretches to make your meditation posture more comfortable, or how to strengthen your body to sit more comfortably, or just, how to better position your seated meditation pose. And again, this is all super helpful, but it's just the beginning of what movement has to offer. I'm more interested in there being a dialogue back and forth between the movement and the meditation, by which I mean the stillness practice, right? I think they can inform each other. So when we practice mindful movement, it can be really a form of body-based mindfulness practice, touching into the full spectrum of mindfulness teachings that include awareness of the body, but also the heart and mind, where we're training ourselves to observe our experiences in the present moment, whether we happen to be moving or sitting still. So I'm going to give a few examples here of how we might draw out the mindfulness lessons that are available in movement. I think these themes are already implicit there in the movement, but if we look for them, we can make them a lot clearer so we can better work with them. So what does that look like? For me, mindful movement or movement-based mindfulness would be a movement practice that has a strong intention of cultivating awareness, exploring present moment experience, and developing mindfulness skills. The first thing that implies to me is more emphasis on what is happening with awareness and attention. That's what we do in meditation, right? We look at how we pay attention and what we pay attention to. This is very possible to do in movement as well. For example, one of the things you learn in meditation is how to find an anchor or an intentional way of using your attention, a place you can put your attention. In sitting, we often do that by bringing our attention to the breath, or by moving attention through the body and noticing the sensations in a body scan. These are all ways of bringing our attention back into the present moment. We can also do that in movement if there are instructions about what you're doing with your attention and how to actually be mindful while experiencing movement and breath and changing sensations. That can be incorporated alongside the positional instructions that tell you which limb to move and how to position and where to place your body parts. And I'm not saying this as a judgment, but I do notice that most of the time, even in a modality that's assumed to be mindful movement like yoga, you tend to get a lot more positional instructions than you do about instructions on what to do with your attention. It's more like following the logistical steps for getting into and out of poses than it is about feeling what effect those postures have on you. This is not always true, but I find this is often the case, that there isn't that much space left for feeling what effect the postures have on you, like your sensations, your nervous system shifts, the emotions that might arise, the thoughts that might be coming up, etc. If you want to work more deliberately with attention in movement, one way you could play with that would be to choose an embodied anchor and repeatedly bring your attention back to it. Like you could say, today in my practice, I'm going to pay attention to my hands. And you could be doing all your usual poses or movements. It doesn't have to even change the sequence at all, which Of course, all of those poses and movements involve more than just your hands, right? But you use the hands as a kind of anchor to regularly bring your attention back to. And yes, you'll really get to know your hands. You'll probably really be feeling them by the end of your practice, and that's great. But you're also developing the ability to place your attention somewhere specific, to focus where you choose. You can see why that might be useful, right? We can also take an approach of practicing a more receptive awareness, which is also part of mindfulness, allowing yourself to notice whatever comes up during the movements. It often helps to slow down your movement or pause between movements so there's more space to notice what's going on and to not make assumptions. You can ask yourself a few open-ended questions like, what sensations are here? What was the effect of that movement? Does something feel different? Where's my attention drawn? You're not necessarily expecting an answer. It's not a quiz that you're supposed to get right or report back on. The question is just a way of inviting that moment of observation. Another big piece of what a movement-based mindfulness practice would include is how we can embody key attitudes of mindfulness. It would be present moment based and encourage attitudes and qualities like curiosity, allowing our experience to be however it is. Mindfulness has an open and non-judgmental flavor to it. And we can notice how often in doing movements or exercises that we sort of go into other more habitual mindsets. So we get to observe this. And that's part of the advantage of this practice because it gives us a laboratory where those traits are being sort of stimulated and we get to train ourselves in noticing them and making these observations that are so informative. Like maybe it comes up when we are learning a new movement and there's that feeling of, I've got to get this right. Or trying a more challenging or an effortful kind of movement, something that brings up the I can't do this thought, or the thought of why is this so hard? I used to be able to ... Or the competitive side, the like, I'm going to nail this, that thought. The ego self, right? It shows up in so many different ways. But it's far from non-judgmental and curious, allowing and receptive at that point, right? The inner critic often comes out to play, and we start to judge our body, its shape, its capabilities, flexibility, coordination, age, size, you name it. We compare ourselves to others and judge our performance, or we compare to our past self, or we judge ourselves for not practicing enough or in the right way, and we start to think about all the things we should be doing. It's exhausting, right? But this is the gift of our mindfulness practice. It allows us to notice all this activity. When we start to bring more mindfulness in, it shows us all of these things that are taking our attention out of the present moment. All of this internal dialogue. And just coming back to the simplicity of what's here now. What am I actually feeling? What are the sensations that are here before interpretation? Or using our mindfulness to recognize and name the thought pattern, right? Oh, this again. This is planning. Or, oh, this is worry. Oh, this is comparing. I see my mind going into that comparing mode again. Without judgment, just noticing this is a human thing that happens and this is what's running right now. It's the program that my mind has pulled up. And just remembering to orient back to these basic mindfulness attitudes, this curiosity and non-judgment, this kindness and this openness, it can help us cut through all of that chatter. A third important element of movement-based mindfulness, and I sort of just started to hint at this, it would be bringing in awareness of the mental and emotional aspects of the experience alongside the practice of body awareness. The idea of checking in with the body was mentioned a lot in the basic Google search I did on mindful movement, but not so much these other layers of our experience. Mindfulness practice starts with the body, which teaches us so much, but as we observe our experience, we also become aware of feeling states and thought patterns too. It's not as if we graduate from the body to the mind. It's more like we start to see how inseparable feelings and thoughts are from the embodied experience. That's all very connected. In the Buddhist teachings, there are the 4 foundations of mindfulness. The first is mindfulness of the body. The second is called feeling tone, which is basically being aware of reactivity. How we are constantly pushed and pulled by our liking, disliking, or feeling ambivalent about pretty much everything. The third foundation is the realm of moods, feelings, and mind states. And then the fourth is about being mindful of certain insights or truths that can be observed and practiced with. So a movement-based mindfulness practice can potentially include ways of practicing with all of those different domains, not just the first one. While doing movement, we can be observing our reactivity, liking this pleasant stretch, disliking this effortful chair pose. We can look at how feelings arise, perhaps evoked by a movement, and how moods sometimes shape our practice choices day to day. When I'm feeling grumpy, do I do my practice the same way as when I'm feeling excited? As I described before, we can pay attention to the thoughts we have, comparing, wanting, planning, all the different flavors of thinking, and we can start to poke holes in the habit of taking our thoughts so seriously or just believing all of those things that get kicked up in the mind. It can be really rich and, to me, much more interesting and applicable to the rest of my life than just going through some rote exercises or entirely focusing on the positional aspects of movement. So then what kind of movement practices support this approach where we really lean into the mindfulness teachings? You might find that certain modalities better lend themselves to movement-based mindfulness. I've definitely found that different movement styles had their own unique gifts that contributed to my mindfulness practice in different ways, which is why I, these days, practice and teach an interdisciplinary kind of mix of movements. If you're curious about that, I did an entire episode a while back where I talked about the things that I've learned specifically from yoga, Qigong, and somatics practice through a mindfulness lens. And that is episode 45, if you want to hear more about specific modalities that do lend themselves to this approach. But in general, I would say that whatever modalities you enjoy and want to draw from, it helps if the moves in your mindful movement are relatively simple. So there's room to focus on the meditative aspects. Slowing down can also be helpful at first, but even more than the pace, I think we need to dial back the complexity. Like, I can imagine it being easier to practice mindfulness while running or jogging than when doing a super creative yoga sequence where you flow into 10 different somewhat complex poses without much of a pause. Because in jogging, the movement might be fast, but it's pretty repetitive and simple. And maybe some of you would argue with me on this example. I don't know. But I find that the movement needs to stay relatively at a simple level. Otherwise, there's never the space to shift from the positional and safety-oriented instructions and thoughts into mindfulness cues where we get to notice more of the fullness of what's going on. Not to pick on yoga, but there has really been this tendency to keep upping the complexity and the physical demand and the risk, or to sequence the poses in continuous motion like flow style, which by necessity requires the practitioner to stay more focused on the logistics of getting from point A to point B. And there's nothing wrong with that focus. It's just that focusing on position and transition is only part of what's possible. Unless we pause or keep things simple enough, we miss actually getting to know the sensations, noticing the emotional shifts, and tracking the nervous system response, and observing all the range of mind states and thought patterns, all the different things I outlined earlier. Approaching it in this way, movement-based mindfulness can be another expression of meditative practice, or it can be an accessible entry point to traditional sitting meditation. I don't really mean for it to be a replacement for sitting meditation, but a complement to it, or sometimes an on-ramp to it. However, for some who don't really have an interest in sitting, they can absolutely benefit from the mindfulness practices you learn in movement. Sitting allows for more collectedness or concentration since less is changing, or sitting still, that's even simpler than the simplest movements, right? It makes it easier to gather your attention around one thing because there's just less stimulation. And that has some benefits, meaning it can allow for a deepening into certain aspects of the meditative experience. So I think stillness is extremely valuable. It's a big part of my practice. And there's a reason why it's been the traditional format that we associate with meditation. But maybe we can do some decompartmentalization between mindful movement and meditation and let them cross-pollinate and enhance each other. Like maybe it can enrich your practice overall or make mindfulness practices accessible to a wider group of people. So that's my take on the question of what is mindful movement. Of course, I'm not arguing that my interpretation is the right one or the only one. The way that I use the term mindful movement might be more specific than the way others use it, and I'm fine with that. For me, it's been important and really helpful to name and describe and reflect on what I'm doing because it helps clarify the intention. And being clear on the intention helps me make choices about how I go about my practice and how I design a class or a practice for my students. So I hope it's also been helpful for you to reflect on, and I would love your feedback on this episode. What do you think about the term movement-based mindfulness? You can always contact me through my website if you have something to share at movedtomeditate.yoga, and find the show notes for each podcast episode there as well, with links to any of the resources that I ever mentioned here. So thank you so much for taking the time to listen today. Take really good care and come back soon. So that's today's episode. If you enjoyed this conversation, please share it with a friend, subscribe on YouTube, or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts and help others find it that way. To learn more about my work, the Moved to Meditate class library, courses, or teacher trainings, go to movedtomeditate.yoga. This is Addie D. Hilster. Thanks so much for listening.